Hello, this time on Sitrep, Ukraine is offering to freeze the front lines of its war for survival as the basis for talking peace. So we're going to bring our mental maps up to date on where those battle lines lie and explain where the military momentum is pressing on them. Moscow is still refusing to talk on these terms, but understanding that picture will help us assess what could come next and the actions that could give Ukraine an advantage.
They could still win it. I don't think they will, but they could still win it. Anything can happen. You know, war is a very strange thing.
Defence Explained.
Despite Putin's rhetoric, he shows no real signs of relenting in his determination to wipe a sovereign nation off the map.
They don't have successful steps on the battlefield. I think that their army is weak now.
This is Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
In the last 8 months, since Donald Trump publicly berated President Zelensky and started talking to President Putin, it has been a brutal roller coaster ride for Ukraine. It's feeling like that might now have halted exactly where it started, and with almost nothing changed, Mike.
Yes, well, the front lines of the battle haven't changed very much now for over a year, but we're into a third type of war now. So the war we saw in 2022 was one type, then it sort of changed into something that resembled a bit more, the sort of Second World War operations, and now it's something really quite hybrid. It's a very different sort of war, dominated by drones. A great deal of fighting, a great deal of killing is going on, but not a lot of movement, because the drones make it very difficult for big forces to move. So the war is not stalemated, it's very dynamic, but on the ground it isn't moving very much. And then we should remember that there's a war also in the Black Sea, and there's an air war and a war of the homelands, which is also part of it and has become more strategically important as this year has gone on.
Well, we'll get a close-up view from Ukraine itself a little later with first-hand insights into what Ukrainian troops are facing. But to help us assess the big picture, we welcome back John Foreman, who has served as the UK's Defence Attché to Russia and to Ukraine, and as a senior analyst to the EU's military staff. Hi, John. Also here, BFBS Forces News reporter Simon Newton. Welcome, everybody. John, we'll come back to the war of words later, but what's your big picture assessment of the state of the kinetic war right now?
Yeah, thank you, Kate. I would say I don't think the front lines have changed that much really in 3 years now. I think if we look at 2025, it's clear the Russian offensive, which they hoped would unlock the Donbass, has failed. I think that's why you're seeing sort of increasingly desperate measures at the front to try and grab as much land as possible before the situation on the ground gets all muddy and everything before the freeze. I expect the fighting to continue at a low level over the winter. And I think at the same time, the emphasis on both sides to try and break morale or inflict economic damage on each other through long-range strikes is sort of going to take precedence.
And Simon, you track progress pretty much day in, day out. I know it's a very crude measure, but how much land has actually changed hands in each direction since the start of this year?
Very little. I think something like 0.4% I read in terms of a change. So a tiny sort of area. The Russians still hold about a fifth of Ukraine, about 44,000 square miles, which is about double the size of the UK. There's been a few breakthroughs in sort of Dobropilia, but only in matters of 15 kilometers where they got behind the Ukrainian lines. Attempts to take places like Pokrovsk have kind of failed. They've not captured a single major city this year, and I was reading that I think at this pace it would take them till about 2030 to get their hands on the Donbass, the areas that Putin desperately wants. So, and as Mike said, this is coming at a huge cost. There's estimated they've lost about 100,000 Russian soldiers killed just this year alone. And I was reading, I think in The Economist, they've aggregated some data to say that the total losses for the Russians would be around anything between 200,000 and 500,000 Russian troops have died, compared to the Ukrainians, which is about 77,000 or something, although they don't give out the data. So basically sort of one Ukrainian for every 5 Russians have died in this war so far. So horrific figures.
So, yeah, they are indeed. Mike, can you just then talk us through the map as it stands right now? Where are those battle lines that Ukraine has offered to freeze?
Well, I always think if you want to describe Ukraine on a map, without a map in front of you, think of a kitchen clock that is like an oval, like a flat oval, and then just below 12 o'clock is Kyiv. And then if you think about around about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, those are the cities of Sumy and Chernihiv. At about 3 o'clock, or somewhere around between 3 and 4 o'clock. There's Kharkiv, which is quite near to the nearest city to the Russian border. And then that's where the fighting is beginning to develop. Kupiansk, you would put it around about 4 o'clock, and the Russians are pushing quite hard on Kupiansk. And then between 4 and 5 o'clock on the clock, that's the Donbass. So that's Luhansk and Donetsk, and that's where the fighting is quite intense. And then come around to 6 o'clock, that's Zaporizhia. And then below that is Crimea, so it's like a little clock hanging below the big clock. And then go around to about 7 o'clock, and that's Odessa and the Chernihiv and the port. And if you go right round to 9 o'clock on the far side of the clock, then you're talking about Lviv, the cities in the west that are relatively safe but have still been hit. So a lot of the fighting is going on up in the northeast, around about the sort of the 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock area, where the Russians are trying to pressurize those cities that are near to the Russian border. But the fighting on the ground that we look at most of the time is down at the sort of 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock area of this kitchen clock of the mind, as I always think of it.
Thanks, Mike. That gives us a very clear image there. And given where those lines sit right now, Mike, what is your assessment of Russia's strategic position versus Ukraine's?
Well, the Russians are pushing very hard, as I say, at Kupiansk to try to break back into Kharkiv. They've been pushing endlessly at Pokrovsk, and that's all about trying to get hold of these fortress cities. So these, at this sort of 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock area of the clock, the big fortress cities of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Droskivka and Kostiantynivka down to Pokrovsk. That's what the Russians really, really want. They haven't taken them at all. They've been fighting to try to get them effectively since 2014 and haven't. And that's a tough one. I think what the Russians must expect, I'm guessing, obviously, but I think one of two things. One is if they keep pressure up all around the front long enough, somehow the Ukrainians will crack. I don't think that's likely, but that's one possible explanation. And the other one is that just by keeping up the pressure, they actually encourage the political process to say the weariness in Ukraine, the weariness in the Western world, to say that if the Russians indicate that they will not stop, surely we've got to pressure Ukraine somehow to make peace on whatever terms they can get. And that's very much the message which the Russians are giving to the Americans, to say, look, we are gaining ground all the time. We're not going to stop. We'll do whatever it takes until you make the Ukrainians give in. This war will only get worse. And that's the narrative, I think, that lies behind this constant push around all these areas of the clock of Ukraine.
What about you, John? You were nodding through some of what Mike was saying there. What's your assessment of Russia's strategic position versus Ukraine's?
Yeah, I think the main effort is the Donbass, Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts. It has been basically since the pivot to the south in 2022. And as Simon was saying, progress there has been at a huge cost, and they haven't made much ground. I think the other attacks, Kupiansk, Sumy, in Kherson, Dnipro, are to distract Ukraine and spread its defences from the Donbass. They've seen some progress in the nibbling in the corner of the Dnipro Oblast, very little progress in Kherson. I saw there was a report they tried an assault across a bridge onto the other side of the Dnipro, which got pushed back at huge costs. So I think fundamentally, if I was in the Russian General Staff to say, if I was assessing 2025, so they probably didn't meet their KPIs, they probably didn't meet the target set to them by Putin to actually conquer the rest of the Donbass. And of course that then throws it back in, we'll talk about later, in the political side, to say Russia is trying to claim the bit of Donbass it can't capture by surrendering the bit of Kherson and Dnipro it doesn't occupy. So again, where this final line is drawn, the actual micro line, I think doesn't matter, but broadly Russia isn't meeting its war goals, its immediate war goals. And I think the second thing is I don't think it's given up its wider, longer term goal to make Ukraine a client state again.
And we've talked a few weeks back, Simon, about the fact that the kill zone is much wider than a classic infantry front line because of how ubiquitous drones are. I don't know if that's making it harder to assess what is actually happening down at the tactical level. Can you still get a sense, though, Simon, of how the battles are being fought at the moment?
Well, one interesting thing I've come across is that the actual number of casualties, or the rate of casualties, has fallen on the Russian side because of the amount of drones that are in there, because it's just so saturated. So they're not making these, what we were seeing as suicidal attempts to to take these areas. But I was going to ask Mike, one of the things I have seen when I spend my time looking at these videos on Telegram, is these kind of, which do look suicidal, these columns of Russian armour heading towards Kyiv, for instance. That's an area we've talked about for a long time, Tokmak, all that area, and also around Dobropilya. Why are they doing that? It doesn't seem to make any sense whatsoever, but apart from it just being a kind of desperate attempt to push
Simon,
forward.
I wish I knew, unless they think from their own intelligence that somehow they could achieve a breakthrough at those places. I mean, Dobropilya is important because that's the highway that connects from the south to the fortress cities, and so if they could take Dobropilya and the area around it, then they could push to the fortress cities from the south, and that's what they were clearly thinking of trying to do a couple of months ago, but they didn't get very far. And if they're throwing armour at it now, then I can only assume that they think that the Ukrainians might crack there. And Kyiv, Tokmak, I mean, that was the area where the Ukrainians tried to break through in 2023, their big failed offensive. The main axis of it, I mean, it had too many axes probably, but I mean, the main axis seemed to be pushing south from Kyiv to try to get to the coast on the Sea of Azov, to actually split the Russian forces, west and east of that line. And the Russians pushing back on Kyiv, that maybe they want to strengthen this up. But I can't give you a sensible strategic rationale from where they are now as to why they might be trying to do that. I can see more logic in going for Dobropilya before the weather closes them down, but I don't think they'll succeed because the Ukrainians are well capable of snuffing out any big movements. I mean, they can still be infiltrated. That's what happened about 6 weeks ago in Dobropilya. But the Ukrainians can certainly snuff out any big armoured movements moving in that direction.
But just on why they would be doing it, I think I agree. It just strikes me as a slight sense of desperation about trying to, with the political pressure to grab as much land as possible. The general staff is throwing bodies and machinery. And I think, as you said, the Ukrainians are well practiced in defeating columns of armour. And there's kills on both sides. That's why this whole battle has degenerated into this hyper-tactical foxhole by foxhole fight, rather than even away from the sort of trenches which we saw in the past. I don't think there'll be a breakthrough by either side for the next 6 months. I think both sides are now resetting for 2026. I think for the Ukrainians it's to maintain their defences throughout the winter, keep inflicting costs on the Russians. I think the Russians will continue to be probing various places because, as we've seen in the previous winters, there's not a pause, it just goes down. I think just on numbers, it's quite interesting. I think when Belousov became the defence minister, one of the things he said, they wanted to reduce casualties. And I didn't think that was because of some sort of humanitarian gesture towards the soldiery and the Russian people. It was basically to reduce the costs, both of recruiting new people and the whole process of having to deal with dead bodies. So they're having to husband their manpower, I think, probably a bit more. There's talk about payments to troops have been reduced to join up in the first place because the cost on the Russian budget, which is also under pressure. There's reports of prisoners not willing to volunteer, having to amend the reserve law to free up men to defend Russia. They can then free soldiers from Russia to send them into the front. What about conscripts? So I think they've got a problem with manpower. Previously, we always said that recruitment outweighed expenditure, say, of dead. I think that's tipped back the other way, and they're now looking at ways to make sure they just don't throw away manpower willy-nilly, as they have done in the past.
And I don't want to suggest for a moment that Ukraine isn't fighting with everything it's got, but John, do you see any scope for Ukraine to do something differently that might seize the momentum?
I think the problem with Ukraine is it's constrained by manpower. I mean, I know that the economists say we're killing 1 to 5, but the population of Ukraine is about a quarter the size of Russia. And of course, how many men have they actually got and how many have actually left and how many have been killed, we don't know. So I think, although Ukraine did an excellent job in defence, ultimately bigger nations normally win or triumph in wars of attrition against smaller nations. I think secondly, Ukraine has got problems with money. I think they need $120 billion to keep going for 2026, and so far Ukraine can provide about 60 billion, so the other 60 billion is going to have to come from somewhere. Now the Europeans have ponied up some money already for 2026, but there's a gap, and that was discussed last week about having nations commit 0.25% of the GDP to Ukraine to keep it going. And I think thirdly is morale for the Ukrainian side. Can they do anything differently? A friend of mine was reporting being, bombed last night in Kyiv, and told me on Facebook, it's just nightly strikes by drones and missiles spectacular. It's not just against energy infrastructure, but against living accommodation, transport hubs, etc., making life very difficult. So it's going to be a very grim winter. So I think that this issue is not military sustainment; it's actually sustaining morale to carry on the fight into next year.
Well, this does seem like, at the moment, to get a snapshot from Ukraine itself. Roman Pahulych is Ukraine frontline correspondent for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and he spent a lot of time at the sharp end of this war. But as we've already mentioned, with drones really changing the character of this conflict around the front lines, he can now only get within a few miles of the infantry battles. He spoke to us from Kyiv on Wednesday morning.
Last time I was in the eastern part of Ukraine 2 weeks ago. I worked near Pokrovsk area, and there we worked with drone operators. It was like 6 kilometers away from the front line. But for now, journalists can just forget about access to the real front line where the infantrymen are based, because of drones make the way really dangerous.
And at that distance from the front line, what were you able to witness?
There were some different locations. One was work of Ukrainian drone interceptors, guys that use FPV or plane-like drones to intercept strike drones, Russian strike drones like Lancet, or some reconnaissance ones like Zal or Lan, etc. The other time we worked with artillery in Kharkiv Oblast, like the same distance from the front line. And so once more we worked with guys who are operating unmanned ground vehicles that are used now for logistics through the front line where it's possible. Every movement to the front line are now a really big danger for life, and sometimes a lot of brigades make this rotation process when, for example, mortar or drone operators or even artillery operators are trying to exchange the crew. They go into their position on their foot, and sometimes it can last for a day or 2 or 3. It really depends on the situation, on this direction right now.
What is the mood like of the troops who are on the front line?
Everyone are exhausted, I would say, because the main problem for now for Ukrainian army are personnel. And it's really not the time when people want something like weaponry or shells. I think on the main directions there are enough of the equipment, but for now people just need more people to have a little more rest, because it's a war of exhaustion, of attrition, and we really see this because people are just sleeping like for 4 hours a day, so people are pretty exhausted, and it's good for them to have some rest.
Very tough conditions. Typically, how long does a soldier spend on the front line?
It depends on how many men are in this regiment, platoon, brigade, etc. Brigades that have enough of personnel, they can rotate their infantry, for example, once for 2 weeks. If it's infantrymen that are operating on the real front line. It's not because they have to stay this long at the front line. It's because the way going there and going back is really hard. They're trying to catch the weather, trying to catch the moment when the adversary isn't active. So the road to the front line or from the front line are more dangerous than just staying there, staying in a hide. But sometimes we frequently hear stories when infantry can stay in position for 100 days, for 200, wow, even 250 days. A few months on a position is a normal practice. It's not normal in terms of living. In terms of 5, 6, 7 kilometers deeper than the front line, at the rear, they, for example, can stay in a position for 7 days, for 10, then maybe 3, 4, 5 days off, but they still have some work to do.
And of course, Russia's air attacks are reaching hundreds of miles beyond the front lines. What is it like for you in Kyiv at the moment?
For example, today it was noisy, I would say. For me, if we are talking about today's night attack, the drones weren't going through my apartment. So it was just a little bit of noise. But my colleagues live on the ways where Russian rockets and drones made their way to their targets, so it was sleepless night. It's not really maybe right to name it casual, but when Russia makes its massive drone and missile attacks, it's casual that it's like hundreds plus drones plus some dozens of rockets. Now we have this point where Ukraine start to having problems with electricity. For example, for now, there is no electricity in Kyiv. We're talking because our generator is working. But some organizations don't have these capabilities, so they don't have luxury to have electricity. For now, it's not a big deal for Kyiv, but if we're talking near border cities like Chernihiv, or Sumy or Kharkiv, the situation there is far more badly than here. Just because the distance from Russia is bigger here, so we don't have here, for example, glide bombs that Russia can throw on Kharkiv or Sumy.
And is what you've described, is it affecting the determination of your country?
I don't think so. Because if you ask in Ukraine if anybody is expecting that there will be a peace deal of some sort, everybody will say no. Even any sociological study in Ukraine shows that the majority of people in Ukraine support that the war should finish not on Russian terms. I don't think that it influences determination of people to fight just because it's going so long and there are too many casualties and people lost their beloved ones. So, no, it's just a routine. It maybe sound a little horrific in terms of understanding a war, but it's just as it is for now in Ukraine.
And do people still have hope? Do you still have hope for Ukraine?
I still do. People still do. People still join army. Ukraine can win only if people will stop to defend their country.
That was Roman Pahulych in Kyiv. Simon, you spent time with Roman almost a year ago. I was struck by just how pragmatic he remains.
Yeah, he's a really impressive chap, actually, very thoughtful, as you can hear. And we met him in Kyiv and made a film with him, actually. I mean, there's 100 Ukrainian journalists have died in this war alone. So, he's very lucky to be alive himself. He talks about being 6 kilometers from the front line. That is still an extremely dangerous place to be. And he was with some Ukrainian troops, and he showed me the film of it, which is he was filming with them. He went outside. They were just standing around, effectively just having a cigarette or something. And a Russian shell landed about 20 feet away from where they were standing. They only survived because it hit a tree as it came in, but he's got hearing damage as a result. A number of the chaps that he was with were severely injured. So he's a very impressive chap to talk to.
Indeed, yeah. I was very privileged to have the chance to talk to him. On the subject of troop numbers, John, can Ukraine actually do anything about that?
Well, I mean, I'm not the expert on recruitment. I mean, I know that the Ukrainians have always resisted reducing the age of people to be mobilised. So I think there's an upper limit, and there's been discussion about do you reduce it down, and I think Trump's discussed that. But the problem there is, of course, the Ukrainians will point out that firstly that cohort of people is quite small because of demographics from 20, 30 years ago. And do you want to sacrifice that generation now? Because that's a generation you will need to rebuild Ukraine in the future. They are the future hope. I also worry about people, as I think he said in his interview, not volunteering. I think people are still joining the army, but there's also people who are seeking to avoid the fight by fleeing abroad to Europe, or shall we say, not volunteering to fight whilst in Ukraine, or people taking measures to get waivers. But I think everybody's pointed towards difficulty of Ukrainian numbers, and I don't think it's going away. But it's ultimately a decision for the Ukrainians because they know their people and the loss rate's better than we do.
I was just been looking into that and really interested to know how many troops Ukraine thinks it needs extra. So they've got about 900,000 in the army at the moment, in the military. They think they need another 500,000 or so, according to Zaluzhny's estimates a few whiles. And they are making some attempts. They've just brought in much tougher draft dodging rules, for instance, to try and stop people doing what John's talking about, which is to getting these white tickets to avoid the draft. You can get your bank account frozen, for instance, or you can lose your driving license for things like that. They're also trying to reach out to the Ukrainian diaspora, which is obviously massive around the world, to try and get them to volunteer to come back, which is proving unsuccessful, unfortunately. The polls have suggested, for instance, that you stop social security payments for Ukrainians who have fled to other European countries to try and incentivize them to go back and fight. And Zelensky's done this interesting thing where John mentioned the draft age, that's gone down to 25, but Zelensky's now allowing 18 to 22-year-olds to actually leave Ukraine, which is basically to try and stop Ukrainian boys disappearing at 18 and never coming back, to give them a window of opportunity to go and see the world, if you like, and come back. So that's very interesting. But I was just saying, we've been on Op Interflex a number of times filming Ukrainian soldiers training. If you talk to the interpreters there, they will tell you that the best Ukrainian men have stayed and fought and died, and they don't really have much time for the other people who have left the country. They get very cross about the idea of men who came from Lviv or Kyiv, as Roman was saying, where the dangers are far less than they are in Sumy, disappearing to America, when you've got 40 and 50-year-olds heading for the trenches. That's just...
There's a political point as well there, Simon, a domestic political point, because as you say, the age for conscription is now down from 27 to 25. And in a way, for a country that's fighting for its life, Ukraine is not as mobilized as you might imagine. And one of the political points is that Zelensky's Servant of the People's Party draws most of its popular support from the younger age groups. And so taking that conscription age down to 22 or 20, or in Britain it's been 18, but taking it down into those cohorts might severely affect the Servant of the People's popular base, and that, cynical as it is a factor in the lack of the sort of complete mobilization that we might have expected in a country fighting for its life.
So I was just going to say, one thing that always strikes me when I go to Kyiv is that you go to the bars, that the number of young people are still there partying, 20-year-olds and stuff, and it's very strange to see that.
And in the Second World War, they were doing exactly the same in London. The bars were full of young people partying,
but they were in the military.
They were all in uniform.
I expressed my concerns. There was a report, I think, on the BBC, and it showed mothers putting their 17, just almost 18 on trains to send to Europe. And it struck me then as it's not a good sign if you see people trying to escape your country, to avoid standing and defending your country. And I think we had, as Michael was saying, the same experience both wars, but conscription from 18 up to whatever it was, 30, 35, 5 million people under arms, everybody was in uniform, mass mobilisation, because we recognised the existential threat post the United Kingdom. And to see Ukraine not do that has always struck me as odd.
And this question of deep strike, Mike, it is a capability advantage that Russia has over Ukraine right now. Could it determine the outcome of the war well away from the front line?
No, deep strike, in a sense, it determines what then happens on the front line. If we're talking about operational level deep strike, so the ability to strike deep against troop concentrations and logistical hubs and transport and so on, that stops things coming to the front line. If by deep strike we're talking about strategic strike, that is, Ukrainian strikes on the Russian oil industry or the Russian refining industry, these sorts of strategic pushes, they normally don't decide wars, but they certainly become an element in the political discussion about how a war may come to an end or how a peace may be arrived at. Apart from the example, I suppose, of the atom bombs on Japan in 1945, it's hard to think of strategic bombing in any situation which has been absolutely decisive. But equally, strategic bombing is always part of the picture when it comes to the exhaustion of one state or the inability of one state to keep up levels of mobilization or whatever it is. So it's not irrelevant But strategic bombing of various sorts, that sort of strategic deep strike, is not normally a deciding factor, or never has been in history, except, I think, for the case of the atom bombs. And even that is contested.
Let's move on now to talk about the weather, because Roman mentioned how it, day by day, is critical to things like troop movements, and winter is coming. Am I right in thinking, Mike, that we're at the muddy stage with frozen ground still a way away?
Yeah, not quite yet. That I keep an eye on the weather. And remember, Ukraine's a very big country, so the weather in northern Ukraine is a bit different from that slightly more Mediterranean weather down in the coast towards Crimea and so on. But the temperatures now are dropping towards late October. It's not especially wet. The next 2 weeks there's showers, or sun and showers. But as the temperature drops, the wet ground from showers doesn't dry out very much because the temperature's going down. And by late November, it then goes below freezing, and that's absolutely predictable. Last 2 weeks of November, the temperature will go below freezing, and that's where you start the big freeze, and that's when things get pretty difficult. The really wet and muddy season is the Rasputitsa, which is in the end of the winter, when all of the ice starts to melt and the snow melts, and then the whole place is very, very muddy, and movement for anybody is difficult. So things are now beginning to change, but it's sort of showery but cooler, and then by the end of November, it'll be below freezing for the next 2 or 3 months.
And you mentioned earlier, John, that you think winter will pretty much halt progress for both sides. Is that right?
Yes, I think the problem is, for both defenders and attackers, that there's no cover. The trees, the bushes, the deciduous, they lose the leaves. The Russians can target Ukrainian defenders, they see where they are, and vice versa. So it tends to drive progress or reduce the tempo of advance both ways. I think the other thing about winter, of course, is, as Roman mentioned, about electricity is off in Kyiv and elsewhere. There's also the issue of heating. Ukraine's. I was in Kyiv when the Russians turned the gas off and the heating was off, and it all got very cold very quickly. And of course, this is the third, fourth. I can't remember how many winters now. 1, 2, 3, fourth winter. I think it's going to be extremely difficult again, and that's why Russia's been, back to the question about deep strike, has been targeting the energy infrastructure to bring the war home to Ukrainian civilians shivering in their bomb shelters. And it's cynical, but it works.
And Simon, what have we seen in previous winters? Does one side cope better than the other?
Well, it's miserable for both sides, as Mike's saying, I suppose. And I think the Russians have fared a little bit less. They obviously have more conscripts who perhaps aren't no training or preparation to really be forced into those situations. The Ukrainians have the advantage of having been given winter kit from the Brits and from the Canadians, a lot of it. So they do have better equipment in terms of clothing. And the problems the Russians have, I guess, is because their supply lines are much longer as well. There's 11 time zones in Russia, and they're bringing stuff from a long distance, so that makes it more difficult for them during the winter months. It all becomes a bit more attritional. Things like oil in vehicles turns to sort of, becomes viscous, and the rubber gaskets crack on this Russian kit, which isn't very good to start with, a lot of it. So you have that issue. So it tends to be a bit more, from what I can make out, a bit more to the Ukrainians' advantage. One question that occurs to me is how well drones will perform, because we're now in this big drone heavy saturation battlefield. How do they perform in wet weather, in sub-zero temperatures, for instance? I'm not an expert, but I presume they don't work as well in these temperatures as they do, in the warm summer months, for instance.
Well, let's try and look ahead now. And John, you understand very well where diplomacy and fighting meet or collide spectacularly. Is something big going to have to shift on the battlefields before peace talks stand any chance of coming back on the agenda?
As I said, I don't think there's going to be a major breakthrough by either side for the foreseeable future. I think Russia's been hoping that. So I don't think that it's going to be a battle for change which drives towards peace. I think the move to, if there is a move towards peace, I still think peace is remote, but proper peace. But if it's going to happen, it's going to be because of pressure placed on Russia. And I think going back to that, the point where the news that broke overnight about Trump finally putting sanctions on the Russian oil sector, has the United States finally shifted in its position to try and coerce Russia seriously to the peace table? Now, we've had 2 months ago with Alaska, that went nowhere. A week ago, we had Trump promising a meeting with Putin in Budapest. That collapsed quite quickly. Now we have seemingly a volte-face. So I don't think the peace will break out by one side or the other, winning on the front line.
And in some ways, it feels extraordinary to be at that point where President Zelensky is ready to effectively admit that Ukraine might give up some of the territory Russia already holds. I guess, Simon, he would row back on it if Ukraine started pushing Russia back again.
Yeah, well, I think, as John says, unless there's some sort of Russian collapse or they get hundreds of Tomahawks, if all the Russian economy really fell apart, it's a very unlikely scenario to happen. One thing I think he has said something similar to this, though. I think about a year ago, he did an interview with Sky, if you remember, with Stuart Ramsey, where he did mention, it was nuanced, but he was saying effectively we would cede some of this territory, I think, if the rest of Ukraine came under the kind of NATO umbrella, and we would then talk about it in diplomatic discussions afterwards. So it's not entirely new what he's saying. But obviously, when I say diplomacy, we're talking about Putin here, obviously, and we've seen how he plays things with Trump in the past few weeks, of course. So there's also the point that Zelensky's bound by the Ukrainian constitution, so he can't actually give this away by virtue of that. And also, if peace does break out, then you can hold a presidential election in Ukraine, as I understand it. So Zelensky could not even be there. So there's so many different variables here, as John says. It's very hard to know where this is going to go next.
Zelensky has signed up to a ceasefire in place. He changed his position, and that, as Simon says, is sort of recognising a de facto partition is the more likely scenario. Russia doesn't want a ceasefire in place because they know it will bake in the position, and their goals are more wide than that. So unless pressure is brought on Putin to call to the ceasefire in place, then the fighting will go on. And Trump had the ceasefire as a precondition before Alaska, which he abandoned and threw everything on the table, which went nowhere. And now we've gone back 360, 180 to before Alaska. We're talking about ceasefires again.
And John mentioned the sanctions that were announced overnight, and the US and the EU have just ratcheted them up, as we know. It's a clear statement of intent, but sanctions haven't made any practical difference so far. Will these do anything, Mike?
Well, they indicate another turn of the wheel from Donald Trump. This time yesterday, he'd refused Tomahawk missiles and he'd bullied Zelensky again. And suddenly here we are 12 hours later, and he's beginning to put pressure on Russia. Now, these we shouldn't overstate this. He overstates them, of course. But, sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, they're not trivial. But this is nothing like the sanctions package he threatened before the Alaska summit, and nothing like the sanctions package that's been, in theory at least, ready to go from Congress. But if it indicates that he's prepared to stay in the game a little bit longer before he leaves it, if he's staying in the game to have another go at pressuring Putin, then it may make some difference. But it's a political difference. On their own, sanctions almost never work on their own, but they're part of an across-the-board package of measures which include, political pressure, diplomatic pressure, military military victory in some areas, and sanctions. So when people are very sort of yet black and white about sanctions, they either work or they don't. Well, no, it depends on what they are part of. And the EU is on their 19th round of sanctions. These will be the first sanctions that America has imposed, first new sanctions America has imposed since Donald Trump became president. So for that reason alone, that is significant politically, but in terms of pressure on Russia, we'll have to see. There'll be all sorts of ways in which Rosneft and Lukoil will find they can deal, even if they can't deal in dollars. They'll still operate, and they'll still be an important part of Russia's oil income, but they won't have as easy a ride as they've had for the last 3 years.
John, how much damage can the Russian economy absorb right now?
Well, I would say, at your point, I think sanctions today have made a difference to Russia's ability to fund this war machine and also get technology. Russia wouldn't have to go out and go to China, North Korea and Iran to get tech in if sanctions weren't working. So there has been an effect. We've seen it in terms of, the deficit is growing, inflation's up, prices are up, they're having to raise taxes. And now the Americans are targeting more closely the oil, as income. So they have had an effect. I think the Russian economy has proven more resilient because Russians have agency and the Russians can do stuff. They can cut spending, they raise taxes or whatever. But I think the original approach of Biden was to slow puncture the Russian economy over a period. Back to Mike's point, it wasn't a sort of quick win. There was too much over-optimism in 2022 that put sanctions on, the Russian economy collapsed, Putin will come to the table. And I would hope that the measures announced by Trump the Senate, apparently there's movement in the Senate as well about congressional sanctions. The threats from Besant about more sanctions if Russia doesn't come to the table. Will America join others about the use of frozen assets? Will Trump speak to Xi this week or next week when he goes to the Asia Pacific to try and convince China to reduce its support? So I think if Trump can help quicker the slow puncture, that will then bring a decision point for Putin. But we'll have to, as Michael said, we'll have to see.
I'm not going to ask anyone to predict what conversation we'll be having about this time next year, unless anyone really wants to. But what are the likely paths? Do we just have to watch and wait? Who wants to answer that? No one.
No, I mean, I think, to be honest, I would say I thought a land for peace deal this year was possible if the Americans decided to use hard power against Russia. Trump didn't use hard power against Russia. 9 months he had a sort of over-optimism that his power of persuasion would bring Putin to the table and they could have there'd be a win-win on both sides and Trump trade could go resume and start building bridges, all fantastic. If Trump is serious about changing course, change American policy, both on arms and economic support and sanctions, then that could be a shift. But as we know, Trump is, as the Russian papers say, both fickle and capricious, and he could easily vote fast back the other way. So we'll just have to see.
Come back and talk to us again. John Foreman, Simon Newton, great to speak to you. Thank you so much. Now, before we wrap up, Mike, you've got a little extra Sitrep project lined up for next week, haven't you?
Yes, I'm going to be interviewing, along with Sean, Bernard Cornwell about his latest book. He's the author of the Sharp series, amongst many other historical series. And his new book, Sharp Storm, is just coming out. And so we're going to talk to him about the book and also a bit about Napoleonic battles and Napoleonic warfare. Everyone knows that Bernard Cornwell is great at getting under the skin of a historical era. His fans know, and I'm one of his greatest fans. I've read every book he's written, including the modern ones as well as the historical ones. And he's great at getting under the skin of a period and getting the detail right, as well as producing rip-roaring stories. So I've read Sharp Storm. I had a pre-publication copy. It's about the crossing of the River Nive at Christmas in 1813. Quite a tough battle as the Wellington's army got into southern France towards Bayonne. And as always with Bernard's books, it's a great read.
Well, we would love to hear any questions you may have for Bernard Cornwell. You can send them to us by email. The address is sitrep@bfbs.com. Good outsourcing, Mike, but you did get to ask him a lot of questions last year yourself as well.
Yes, we did a podcast about Wellington. We did it from Horse Guards, from the Wellington's office in Horse Guards. And it was based on, just a year ago, I produced my book on great British commanders. And we did a series of podcasts on the basis of those commanders. And the one on Wellington, we did it as an interview with Bernard. And one of the things that I got to talk a bit about then, and which I want to take up with him now, he loves bad weather. He loves describing bad weather because he's very good at describing the personal experience of a soldier in the army. So he absolutely loves describing driving rain and snow and uniforms that are wet and never dry out, and you put them in front of the fire, and the next morning you're putting on a damp uniform and you've got to climb up a hill, and he loves bad weather. And in this case, I mean, the Battle of the River Nive was in Christmas 1813. It was bad weather, so his bad weather was really authentic. But I think he writes gratuitously about bad weather. I think. I mean, he gives this dreadful man Sharp, this bad mouthing, high swearing, belligerent, principled soldier, so much time. I mean, I've often wondered, what is it? Why has Richard Sharp got such a hold on you, Bernard? Why won't he let you retire? He won't let you stop writing about him. And the point I always think of is that, if we could really bring Richard Sharp back to real life, not just the life that Bernard gives him, if we could really bring him back to real life, he wouldn't like us very much. And he wouldn't like you, Bernard. He wouldn't like the sort of person you are, sort of a writer who doesn't have to endure bad weather all the time. So we're going to have a good discussion, I'm sure, with Bernard next week. And I suspect we'll talk a bit about the weather.
Not going to Horse Guards again then?
No, it's going to be a studio in Soho. Looking forward to it.
In the nice warm with Bernard, then that'll be good. Look forward to hearing that conversation. Thank you, Mike. And thanks once again to Simon Newton and John Foreman. Professor Michael Clarke and I will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. And don't forget to email your questions for Bernard Cornwell to sitrep@bfbs.com. From me, Kate Gerbeau. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.